Welcome to week 2. Today we're going to make an apple pie using the dough we made last week. Before you begin, you want to make sure that you have some lemon juice ready to toss the apples in as soon as they're cut. The lemon juice will help prevent the apples from oxidizing or turning brown. Although it's not in your manual, I find before I juice the lemon, I like to zest it and put a little bit of the zest in the pie filling just to make it a little bit brighter tasting. This, like I explained last week, is a microplane. If you hold your lemon like this, hold your microplane like this, and run the lemon along the microplane, it will give you nice fine zest like that, and you can set that aside for later. Then you can cut your lemon, juice it, and have that at the ready. It's important to choose the right apple for your apple pie. The apples should be a nice balance between sweetness and acidity, and should be able to maintain their shape when they're cooked. In your manual, there's a list of apples and what purposes they're best for in baking. My favorite apples for apple pie are Northern Spy, Pink Lady, Cortland, and Crispin, as they have a good balance between sweet and acidity. When you go to get your apples ready, the first thing you're going to do is peel them. Inside of apple skin, just underneath, there's a layer of something called pectin. Pectin is a naturally occurring starch that when cooked with acid and sugar will help to gelatinize the filling and make it thicker. So it's good to have a peeler that doesn't cut off too much of the underlayer of the skin, so you have a little bit of pectin. When you're peeling, you can have a bowl at the side just to put the scraps. Some apples that are not great to use in apple pie making are Red Delicious, for example, because they're quite mealy. Macintosh, because even though they're delicious to eat, they cook down to almost like an applesauce consistency, and they won't maintain a nice integrity when it's inside of a pie. Now I'm just going to continue to peel all my apples until they're ready. Once I'm done peeling all the apples, what I do is turn the apples on their side and just cut the bottom flat so it doesn't wobble around when I'm cutting it, and it's a little bit safer. Then I curl my hands like this, and I cut the apple into 4 pieces. Now the core will be exposed. I take a paring knife, and I just cut off the extra skin if there is any, and just only as much core as I need to take out until I reach apple again. Be careful when you're doing this so you don't cut your fingers. Okay, just like that. Now I'm going to cut this into pieces. You want to cut the apple in pieces that are thick enough so that when they cook, they're not going to disintegrate. So again, hold your fingers bent like this, the blade against the bent fingers, and rock the blade back and forth. My apple slices are about that thick, okay? If they're thinner than that, again, they will disintegrate when they cook. You can also chop your apple the other way into irregular shapes the other direction as well. It's completely up to you the way you want to do it. I'll cut one just to show you, and then I'll continue to cut the rest. Okay, just like this. Now you're going to take your apples and put them in a separate bowl. Once all the apples are cut, you're going to immediately toss them in lemon juice so they don't start to brown. Once the apples are all cut, you're going to add in your lemon juice. And toss. And again, this will prevent oxidation. They still will brown a little bit, but it will prevent a lot of that browning. The next step is to add the sugar. Now in this recipe, I've divided the sugar into 2 amounts, and I'm going to put the first amount, so half and half, I'm going to put the first half of the sugar in with the apples now. And then I'm going to toss it. Then what I'll do is cover the apples with saran and allow it to sit for about 20 minutes. And what's going to happen is that the sugar will actually leach out the juices from the apple in a process called maceration. Once some of the juices have come out of the apple, I'm actually going to strain out those juices. And the reason I do that is so that when we put the apples in the oven, the pie doesn't get too soggy with all of the moisture of the apples coming out inside the pie as it cooks. There'll still be lots of moisture left inside after the 20 minutes of maceration, but it won't be quite as much as if I were just to put them all in the oven without doing this process. So you can choose not to do this step, but I think it's a great step so you don't end up with a pie with a soggy bottom crust. Cover this with saran, allow it to sit 20 minutes, and then we'll continue the rest of the filling after that. Once the apples have macerated for 20 minutes, we're going to take them out of the bowl. And you can see they have oxidized a little bit. They have turned a little bit brown, but not nearly as badly as if we hadn't added the lemon juice. Now you can see how much liquid has come out of the apples. If we hadn't macerated the apples, all of this liquid would come out into the pie, and we could risk making the pie dough, the bottom crust of the pie dough, soggy. So now what we're going to do is take the apples and remove them from this liquid. And put them into a fresh bowl. Now you don't have to get rid of this liquid. You can always use it as simple syrup, which is just water and sugar mixed together and usually brought to a boil. So what you could do is use this as a simple syrup, use it inside of a drink, or you could use it inside of a cake to moisten a cake. So you can always use it if you don't want to get rid of it. Now we're going to prepare the rest of the filling. So we'll set the apples aside briefly. I'm going to melt some butter to put inside. So we'll just put the butter on the induction burner or a burner at home. Put it on low heat just to melt it. In the meantime, while that's melting, we're going to take the other half of the sugar, the half that wasn't in with the macerating apples. And do you remember earlier I said that we would zest the lemon before we juiced it, just so we'd have the lemon zest as well to make the inside of the pie filling even brighter in flavor? So what I usually like to do is I take the lemon zest and I actually rub it into the sugar. And the reason I do this is because it releases the essential oils of the lemon zest, and it extracts a lot of lemon flavor that you wouldn't otherwise get if you just tossed the lemon zest in. As soon as you see that this starts to melt, just set it off to the side. You should be able to smell the beautiful lemon flavor coming through. And now we're going to add in cornstarch. And the cornstarch will help to thicken the inside of the pie filling. So cornstarch is activated at boiling point. When it goes in the oven and the apple pie starts to cook, the cornstarch will start to activate. And it will start to absorb the moisture, and the granules of starch will swell, and it will start to thicken the filling. I whisk it together with my sugar so that when I add it to the apples, it doesn't clump up. Now, cinnamon to taste. It's all dependent on how much cinnamon you like in your apple pie. I like quite a bit, so I'm going to pop that in. You can also add any other kinds of spices, so allspice, nutmeg, clove, cardamom, whatever you like into your apple pie. It's up to you. Now I'm going to take the dry ingredients, toss them into the apples, just to combine. And if I look at it and say, well, I could add a bit more cinnamon, I can always add that now before it goes into the pie shell. Starting to smell really nice. And then I'm going to put my melted butter in there. And the melted butter just adds a really, really nice richness to the filling. A lot of people will actually dot little cubes of butter on top of the apple filling right before they put the top crust on the pie. This is another way of doing that. So now you're going to set this aside, and then we will roll the pie crust. Now it's time to roll out the pie dough. We're going to roll one round for the bottom crust and one round for the top crust. It's always best to roll pie dough when it's cold, quite firm. And what you probably will have to do is just kind of push it in between in your hands, so the heat of your hands can kind of warm it up slightly. What will happen probably as you roll it is it will start to crack just a little bit on the edges, so you may have to just push it back together. You can see the little pea-sized particles of fat in there. That's exactly what we want. We're going to roll the pie crust into this aluminum tin. This is 9 inches from side to side. So when we are rolling the bottom crust, we want to make sure we roll it about 2 fingers wider than it needs to be so that it can actually fit down inside of the tin. So there's many, many ways to roll dough. I'm going to show you the way that I find the easiest for the bottom crust, and then I'm going to show you another method for the top crust. And you can decide what works best for you. So I have here a piece of cling film, and I have cut it so that it is bigger than the tin itself, at least 2 fingers wider. I'm going to put a little bit of flour onto that, put my pie dough down, and I want to press it fairly flat with my hands before I actually start to roll it. And the reason for that is that it doesn't crack as much on the sides if it's already pressed flat before you start to roll. Then I'm going to put a little bit more flour on the top. Don't go crazy because, again, adding more flour adds more gluten. And then put another piece of cling film on top. What you're going to do is roll the dough between these 2 pieces. And there's a couple of reasons why I like this. One is that the dough never sticks to the table. Another is that you don't have to use as much flour because anytime it sticks, you can always just unstick it, lift it and unstick it. And once it's rolled, you don't even have to pick it up. You can flip it into the tin right on the cling film. So I'll show you what I mean. So we're going to roll once from the center up and once from the center down. This will elongate the dough. And then I'm going to roll once from the bottom left to the top right, and once from the bottom right to the top left. And there's a reason why I roll this way, because I find if you roll the dough in each direction once, instead of getting a really long rectangle, it will stay more or less a circular shape. Now, I've rolled once, and you can see it's already starting to crack. So you want to just patch up those cracks. And then the dough is already sticking to the bottom of the bottom piece of cling wrap. So what I want to do is flip it. So I'm going to lift it up and flip it over. Unstick it, and that's it. You don't have to add a ton more flour. You can just continue to roll just like this. So again, once up and down, once diagonal one way, once diagonal the other way. And you can see that it's still keeping its round shape, but it is sticking. So again, remove. And then flip it upside down. And you can see the little pieces of fat in there. Now, I'm just patching up my outer edges. If you don't patch up these cracks, you will continue to get a larger and larger crack from that source as you roll. So you have to make sure you patch them up really, really well. And keep comparing the dough to your tin. because you only want it to go about 2 fingers wider than the tin. Don't roll it so big that it's very thin, too thin. Just a tiny bit more flour on the top. And then lift and flip. Unstick and roll. Once you have the dough where it's about 2 fingers wider than the largest part of the tin, you can stop rolling. And then the great part about using the cling film is that you literally pick up the dough, transfer it right on top of the tin, and it's still on the cling film. And then you can use that to push it in to the tin itself. I use my finger to push it right into the bottom edge of that tin. And then once you're ready, you can unwrap. And you can see there's barely any flour on your table. Now, you can see here how far over it's hanging from the bottom of the tin. So what you can do is just trim it. You want to leave it at least about an inch overhanging from the tin, and I'll explain why in just a second. So we'll grab our kitchen shears and we'll cut that. Then you can just cut off the extra. So there's about an inch overhang all the way around. Remember, make sure to use scissors that are only used for kitchen purposes, not used to cut paper or anything like that. The extra dough can always be rolled out for another purpose, added into another pie dough, or rolled out with cinnamon sugar and butter and rolled up like little cinnamon rolls and baked. All sorts of fun things you can do. Now you can just set that aside until we're ready for the top crust. We're going to roll the second piece of dough out in a different way. So we're just going to push it together between our hands to soften it slightly. And then flour the table. Now, when we're rolling the dough on the table, we have to flour it more than we do if we're using cling wrap. Otherwise, it will stick. So this is a good amount here. And a little bit more on top. And we're still going to roll the same way, center up, center down, but you can see it's sticking a little bit. So if that happens, you always have to re-flour. Extra flour can definitely be dusted off after you're done rolling the dough. So center up, center down. If it starts to stick, just patch it together. A little bit more flour, and then side, diagonal, and diagonal other side. Always rotate the dough as you roll it, because if it starts to stick, as long as you rotate it and give it a quarter turn in between rolls, it shouldn't end up sticking to your table too much. Okay, so center up, center down, diagonal, diagonal. Now again, see that it's sticking, so just gently pull it off, reshape it into a circle, and give it a quarter turn and roll it around in that excess flour so it doesn't stick. Again, a little more flour just on top. And you'll see me doing this a lot with the rolling pin. Sometimes you get dough stuck to the rolling pin, and if you roll it over top of your pie crust, it's going to leave holes. So I try to either take my hand and clean it off, or use a metal bench scraper and clean it off. Diagonal from the sides. And this dough, you also want it to be about 2 inches or 2 fingers bigger than it needs to be. So this is now 11 by 11. So now I know it's the appropriate size, and I'm ready to finish my pie. So I'll set this to the side quickly, clean off the table, and then we're going to finish the pie. Now it's time to finish off the pies. So You want to just toss the filling one more time because as you see, there will be some juice that's fallen to the bottom. This juice doesn't have to be thrown away because now that we have cornstarch in here and there's some juice already taken off of the apples, the rest of this will thicken in the oven with the cornstarch. Sometimes people will put a little layer of marzipan or a layer of cake crumbs or graham crumbs in here to absorb the moisture. You don't have to, absolutely. And then just put the apples in, but make sure they're packed tightly so there's no empty spaces between the apples. And usually I just pour the juice on top at the end and it will sort of trickle down. Push them in very firmly. I usually mound them up a little bit more in the center. Sometimes people will take this juice and cook it in a pot and activate the cornstarch by doing that and then reconstitute it into the apples. So that's another thing that you can do as well. There are many different ways that you can do this. Now, sometimes pies with a very liquidy filling, for example, a quiche or something like that, will have to have the crust blind baked or partially baked before you put the filling in. With apple pie, you don't necessarily need to do that. Because the filling isn't so wet, it doesn't require you to pre-bake it. So I'm just going to pour the rest of this filling inside, let it trickle down. Now it's time to put the top crust on, but we have to glue it on somehow. So what we're going to do is make an egg wash. And egg wash can be many things, but normally what people do is take a whole egg and mix it really well. Sometimes people will add water to this egg to thin it out. Sometimes people will add a little bit of milk to this egg so that when you brush it on top of your pie, the sugars in the milk will caramelize and make a darker crust. But if you add milk, it will soften the crust slightly. I prefer to use just a tiny bit of water to thin this out. You want to make sure that it's completely mixed, that you don't have little bits of yolk or white. And then just a tiny bit of water to that. This will be brushed on top of the pie and it will help to give it a beautiful dark color in the oven. So you want to brush that egg wash all around the outside edge of the pie. And this, like I said, will act as glue to glue the top crust on. Okay. Now, we just rolled the top crust. What I can do is fold it over. That way I can see the exact center of my pie and then unfold. Okay. And I want to cut this dough so it meets the dough on the bottom. So I'm going to use my kitchen shears and just cut both of those doughs to make sure they meet together. Okay. So once you've done that, what you're going to do is actually roll the top crust under the bottom crust and squeeze. And what this is going to do is give you a thicker edge to your pie so that you can give it a little bit of a fluted edge, but also it's going to ensure that when the pie bakes, the top crust doesn't come apart from the bottom crust and open up. So just roll under and then push with your finger against your thumb to round out that edge. Now you're going to flute the edge of the pie. And this is how you do that. You're going to take your two fingers like this and push the dough into that, with these two fingers up into your middle finger and squeeze. So I'll show you what I mean. Now sometimes I like to dip my fingers in flour before I do this. So put your fingers like this on the dough, push the dough into your finger and squeeze. And that will create a little flute. Then you're going to move over so your thumb is at the bottom edge of that fluted edge and push in again. If your dough is sticky, flour your fingers. So you see what I'm doing? Pushing in between my two fingers like that. All the way around. Sometimes if I'm finished my pie dough and I want my pie dough edge to stay this beautiful fluted shape, I will chill the dough very briefly in the fridge to solidify it, and then I'll put it into the oven. So you can pop it in the freezer for maybe 5 minutes or in the fridge for about 10 minutes, and it will firm up the dough just so that you don't lose your shape. Now once you're done that fluted edge, you'll notice that it looks more rounded than pointy. So what you can do then is go back in and squeeze so that it looks a little bit more pointy. Squeeze this side and squeeze this side. Squeeze and squeeze. And that will make it just a little bit more pointy and a little bit more defined. So when you're done, your pie dough should look like this, with a beautiful fluted edge. The next step is egg wash. So we'll take our egg wash and we'll apply it liberally on the top of the pie dough. You don't have to egg wash the fluted edge. It will brown up quite quickly in the oven. And like I said, you can chill this briefly to set the dough and then pop it in the oven. If your egg wash pools a lot in these inner edges, just use your brush to pull it back up. You don't want big pools of egg wash because that part will then burn. Now, what I like to do is take a little bit of turbinado sugar. This is a less refined sugar that has a larger grain and it's a little bit browner than regular sugar, and sprinkle it over the entire top of the apple pie. This just gives it a really, really nice crunch. Really nice to eat. If you don't have turbinado sugar at home, you can also just use granulated sugar. That's fine as well. It just won't show up quite as much. And then in order to finish the pie, you need to cut a little vent in the top because when the pie bakes, it's going to create a lot of steam. And if you don't have a vent for the steam to escape, the top will kind of, it might even just pop off, separate on the side. So take your piping tip, the larger end of a piping tip, and place it right in the center of the pie and wiggle it a little bit to cut through the dough. And then just remove that dough, and that will be your little vent. This pie will go into a 350-degree oven for about 45 minutes. Make sure you put it onto a sheet tray so that if juice does bubble over, it doesn't bubble into the bottom of your oven. So place it on the sheet tray and into the oven. The pie is done when it's a beautiful golden brown with a crisp crust. You'll probably see a little bit of juice peeking out here and there as well. Leave the pie to cool for several hours to room temperature before eating. Enjoy!